Dear fellow NGO participants, I believe we all in the Western Balkans have experienced in the last years a growing trend of legal measures from respective national governments aiming to over-regulate NPO sector in response to money value recommendations and findings coming out of mutual evaluations. What we have noticed here in Albania with quite some level of concern, I have to say, but also in the region by talking to our peer organizations, is that governments, in order to obtain a good rating in the mutual evaluations, are over-regulating the NPO sector by applying a one-size-fits-all instead of a risk-based approach. While the over-regulation is hurting the NPO activity, at the same time, it is not helping even the national governments to effectively address issues of AML and CFT. More and more, FATF and money value recommendations are used as justification for shrinking space, civic space. And in fact, in many cases, even closing the space for debate and consultation with NPOs under the so-called obligation to comply with international standards. At a time when money laundering and financing of terrorism have become hot topic in the Balkans, legal actions and political rhetoric targeting NPO sector as a whole is creating an acid environment for the NPO activity. It is contributing in decreasing the level of trust in NPOs by portraying them as the main risk factor compared to other sectors and industries in the country. At the same time, the lack of understanding by the NPO sector of the issues of AML and CFT in relation to their activity is not helping either. The sector needs to better understand how the fight against such practices is addressed at global level. Who are and what is the mandate of the relevant global and regional bodies such as Fatf and Manival in this area? What are their governing principles and standards they promote? Who are the main NPO sectors and coalition on these topics? We believe that such understanding from the sector is crucial for two reasons. Firstly, to enable the NPO sector to effectively engage with country decision-making institutions in determining whether the sector is at risk of being abused for terrorism financing, and propose the right measures to mitigate the risk without hurting the NPO sector activity and infringing basic freedoms of association and privacy rights. Secondly, to know how to push back when they face overregulation caused by anti-money laundering, combating financing of terrorism, and counter-terrorism standards. The Western Balkan countries are at different phases, in fact, in this process. The formal engagement and experience of NPOs in designing the risk assessment methodology or conducting shadow country risk assessments is also different. I hope that the cases brought in the today workshop by leading NPOs in the Western Balkan countries and Turkey engaged in these processes will contribute to the learning curve of all of us with regard to such complex issues. The discussion will help to share experiences and lessons learned on this very new way of cooperating with relevant state institutions and civil society actors. I strongly believe that with the technical support and know-how of the European Center for Non-for-Profit Law, a long-standing partner of most of us, the convening power of Balkan Civil Society Development Network, and the financial support and technical contribution by GIZ, Global Projects Combating Illicit Financial Flows, the civil society in the Balkans has, in fact, a very good chance for starting a coordinated effort to tackle issues of AML and CFT and restrictions associated with government measures. At the same time, we hope to contribute to a more aware sector by also opening a public debate around these issues. Before I open the floor for presentations and discussions, a couple of technical issues about the debate today. As you have seen, you have access to microphones. So when we have the open up the space for discussion and questions, please, if you can raise the hand by using the hand icon. So the moderator, me on or Claudie, that will follow up with the second part of the debate, can give the floor to the participants. Please, before you take the floor, if you can introduce yourself and the organization, just that, so we know who is speaking and on whom behalf. And that is basically all. The discussion is planned to last 2 hours. And for the first panel, which we will have 2 other distinguished partners and supporters from GIZ and ECNL, I'll be moderating, and I'll leave to Clotilda Tavani, Director of Programs at Partners Albania, to moderate. So thank you once again for joining us in this discussion. I'm very glad to see that we have a very broad participation from the entire Western Balkans and Turkey, although the issue is not very still not very common and popular among civil society actors. And that's why I think this discussion is also even a bigger contribution in building this awareness among the sector. Now, without further ado, I have the pleasure to give the floor to Ms. Marina Kovacic, Regional Director for Western Balkans, the global program fighting against illicit financial flows. Marina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Julie. Good morning, good afternoon, almost everyone, dear colleagues. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Partners Albania, for the dedication and the enthusiasm to work with us on the matter. I'm Marina Kovacic. I'm the regional coordinator of the global program of GIZ, combating illicit financial flows. I know illicit financial flows might seem very abstract, and I will not dive into what it means, but part of the activities which are directly part also of our concept of working in these illegal financial flows is protection and prevention from money laundering and combating financing of terrorism. It is a pleasure to be here, and I thank you very much for joining us in this number. This clearly shows that the topic triggers interest from the civil society in our region and wider, but also I assume there is also a need for the sector to partake in the talks, in the discussions, but as well in development of policies and frameworks which affect the work of civil society at large. As a global program, we are global due to our structure and how we work in different parts of the world. We are based in Skopje as part of the so-called Western Balkan hub. We have also a hub in Latin America. We have a hub in North and West Africa and South and East Africa. We have teams who work on the field on the same topic in different contexts with different mechanisms, but we try to coordinate and consolidate all the efforts to bring better results. As you know, and Julie already mentioned, the money laundering and CFT regime have become very rigorous and strict. And initially as a system, and basically as a system, is mainly developed and designed for the private sector and businesses who are mostly prone to abuses and misuse for different purposes in this field. Nevertheless, the standards have been implemented in a way that include also civil society organizations having the business idea behind. And it's needless to say that such approach is neither proper nor useful for the non-profit organization. We changed the terminology of non-profit due to the standards that have been developed and which will loosen a bit exactly because of the civil society engagement in their advocacy in loosening up the standards which would provide better environment for the civil society to work. So recommendation 8 of the FATF standards has been understood and implemented very strictly in the jurisdiction. And initially they were indicating that the NPOs or the civil society organization are especially vulnerable and at risk to financing of terrorism. And this approach put the whole civil society under burdensome implementation methods, which had an effect in shrinking the civic space, posing risks to sustainability of the organization in access to funding, persecution, or even misuse of the standard or behind the umbrella of the standards for authorities to push the different agendas. However, in the meantime, due to the involvement exactly of a wide area of stakeholders and actors, involvement and advocacy of civil society organizations, the standards have been changed. And currently, the requirements are that the countries should take a risk-based approach and develop targeted measures. This clearly goes in what Julie initially said, that countries, in order to achieve compliance with the standard, they usually, and the regime of MLA CFT was designed in such ways which was clustered and developed mainly by state authorities. However, these revised standards now intend to involve the civil society much deeper and ensure they are not left outside in the discussion and in the policy making process. And this is exactly what we as a development organization, as a program, would like to emphasize, is that this exactly through the engaged and participatory cross-sectoral, multi-sectoral approach, engaging civil society organization, international organization, banks, as a private sector actors, regulators, and governments, would develop an acceptable and sustainable solution which will provide enabling, so-called enabling environment for civil society work. There have been cases, and I assume during the discussion we will hear your perspective on what are the obstacles that you are facing in this, what are the measures that you are taking, but also how the environment enables or disables you to perform what you are designed and set up to do. So I would not take much actually of your time. We would like actually to hear more from you and engage you in the process and see your perspective and see where we can find solution for joint efforts. GIZ and the global program would definitely support all of you in achieving a much better situation for civil society to work, because without civil society, any governmental policy or framework would not neither fit nor would be taken as a compliance regarding the standards, which are changing and I assume in our favor, but there is also a role that we should play to make this happen. So thank you very much. Thank you to all the partners here. I wish you a pleasant and productive day. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you, Marina. Marina, thank you once again. I think you mentioned as part of your presentation the approach that the project has applied to address this issue by involving the sector, and I really would like to applaud you for that, because you are the first one, and your involvement is coming in a very right time when this issue is becoming very burdensome for the sector in the region. So thank you once again for the very inclusive approach, and not only that, but also helping, and this is not only in Albania, you are working in other Balkan countries to make sure that respective state institutions are also more open to our participation in these processes. So thank you once again, Marina. And now
Julie, Julie,
yeah.
Sorry, one more thing. This also ring a bell of one of the experiences which we had earlier in Macedonia, but also starting also in Albania,
yeah.
in Montenegro as well. That there is also a thing that we all have in our mentality as prejudices. We are starting maybe from them addressing some of the issues, and this goes both ways, from the governmental and authority side and from the civil society. And these processes we witness that make change. And I assume the colleagues from Macedonia will share that experience and would break the wall maybe that exists between these parallel universe silos, as we usually say. So thank you again, and I wish you all the best.
Exactly, Marina, and in fact I had Macedonia in mind when I said that, and that's why I also emphasized as part of my opening speech that this is there are two parties in this process, and more than ever it needs awareness and willingness on both parties to cooperate. So now I have the pleasure to give the floor to Ms. Vanja Skoric, Director of Program at European Center for Non-for-Profit Law. Vanja is also, beside her very long standing involvement of about 20 years legal experience in the region and globally, she is also a civil society representative at Fatf Private Sector Consultative Forum. And Vanja has lots of experience and insights to share with us regarding these processes, but also global trends to this regard. So the floor is to you, Marina. Vanja, sorry.
No problem. Good morning, everyone. And thank you once again for joining forces and for organizing this workshop. I'm very happy to see a lot of familiar faces here, but I'm also happy to see new faces and new names, new colleagues joining in, and in great numbers, as Juliana, you already mentioned, which really does show the interest and the burning of the issue in the region. I'll shortly share my screen and a very short, brief presentation on what is happening regionally and globally. I will also ask for patience from some of you who are very much aware and knowledgeable about this topic, because of the new colleagues who have not been exposed to this topic and this issue. We'll just shortly, in a few minutes, recap some of the main points of what are we talking about when we talk about anti-money laundering, counterterrorism financing, and when we talk about the FATF and Moneyval. So as many of you know, we at ECNL have been working for a number of years on global, regional, and national level on this topic. Globally, as a part of the core group of the global NPO coalition that was advocating for change of these standards, and now engaged with a global standard setter body, FATF, on implementation and the trainings about the standards. Regionally, of course, with many of you in the Western Balkans and Turkey, in countries where we supported and helped or implemented some of the examples. In fact, I think all examples that will be mentioned later today. There is still so much to learn after all these years, after all our engagement in the Western Balkans. Each new country example, each new situation brings completely new challenges and also opportunities for learning. And that's why we think this regional exchange is extremely important for all of our colleagues. So I will share for the beginning a few regional insights actually from the latest BIRN network blog post about concretely what is happening with counterterrorism financing in the Western Balkans region. The concerns over the terrorist financing risk are real. We need to acknowledge that as a sector, as civil society. And some of these concerns are the following for our region. First, the support or financing of the foreign fighters, also sometimes through donations. I'll give you an example. The latest figures for the Bosnia and Herzegovina, since 2020, around 200 men and 70 women have departed as foreign fighters, and around 100 people have been convicted of terrorism. 5 of those convicted of financing terrorism, 1 in Albania, 4 in Serbia. That's the regional landscape. Turkey is not included in this regional coverage, just to mention that. Also of concern is a low track record of investigations, prosecutions, convictions in all of the Western Balkan countries. Funding system for terrorism is very complex, and in some cases, in very limited number of cases, but they do exist, it also goes through some of the foundations or humanitarian organizations. And for countries, the really key issue is cutting off the access to those funds. Having said that, institutions and the governments do need to have capacity to both assess and prevent those risks of terrorist financing through the nonprofit sector, civil society, but also ensuring that it does not unduly restrict and it does not harm the legally protected activities of civil society. Some of the country snapshots in recent developments and some of the country concerns. For Bosnia and Herzegovina, this is a struggle to adopt actually vital legislation concerning money laundering and terrorism financing. They recently exited from the FATF gray list. We'll talk about that, what that is. And there is obstructed implementation of the laws and even the adoption of legislation. For Serbia, the concern is a higher risk for money laundering and terrorism financing, but not for civil society sector, for other sectors. However, the concern is also lack of number of prosecutions for these crimes. And of course, we'll hear about the case of the state investigations and its abuse of power towards civil society regarding this topic. For Albania, it was concerned that there is urgency to be more vigilant due to extremists in the country financed through charity organizations. In North Macedonia, the recent assessment report estimated that the risk of terrorism is low and the risk of financing terrorism is low to medium. And our colleague from Macedonia will talk more about how they work with the government to achieve this assessment. And the focus is mostly concerned on humanitarian or religious organizations and the private sector, parts of the private sector. For Montenegro, the report notes concern for religious charities among those organizations that are under observation. You can find more on BIRN website from March 2021 if you are interested more in depth for these country snapshots and developments. Now, we mentioned FATF a couple of times, and for those colleagues who are still not familiar with what it is, it's actually a global standard setting body that sets the recommendations and standards for fighting money laundering and for counterterrorism financing. And essentially the entire world has committed to these standards, all the countries and territories in the world, almost all of them. Some of them do it directly through the FATF as a global body. Most of them do it through regional bodies, such as Manival. Manival is the regional body that covers the Western Balkans. Turkey is a direct member of the FATF. So when we talk about Manival, that covers Western Balkans, FATF covers Turkey. And some of the distinctions of the role, the FATF's role is, as I mentioned, setting the standards. So they have 40 different standards called the recommendations. And one of them, recommendation 8, covers civil society, what they call the non-profit organizations. They also set the standards on effective implementation for its recommendations, known as immediate outcomes. For their own members, the FATF assesses the implementation of these standards. So they assess each country compliance through the mutual evaluation process. They write up a report and then they follow up on the progress of this report. That's why this system is very effective, essentially. So although the FATF standards are not international law in a strict sense, because the FATF is not an international organization in strict sense, their compliance mechanisms is very strong. These mutual evaluation processes and reports can have real economic consequences for the countries, because the countries that score low or are found to have serious problems or deficiencies in the implementation, they will get bad credit rating, they will not get investments, or they will not have ability to get loans from IMF, from development banks, their investment rating will be lowered, and so on. So there are clear economic consequences for the countries, and that's why countries are eager to comply with these standards. And that catches us as non-profit organizations into that compliance net as well. FATF also develops training modules for the countries on how to implement the standards, and they engage informally with private sector and civil society. As Juliana mentioned, we are part of their private sector consultative forum. So that's on global level. They also develop black and gray lists. So these are countries that have very strategic deficiencies in implementing their regimes for countering money laundering and terrorism financing. Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina used to be on the gray list. Currently, Albania is the only one from the region on the gray list. Now, that has serious impact on the country, as I mentioned, and that's why countries are very motivated to comply. Manival, as a regional body, is a part of the Council of Europe, as well as FATF's regional body. They assess compliance through mutual evaluation process for members only, so for all Western Balkan countries. They also do some training and education for their member states. They have started with something interesting this year. They are doing a regional risk assessment for civil society, for non-profit sector, that involves all Western Balkan countries and Turkey. This is underway. Some of you already know, I have reached out to you about this process. ECNL is a part of conducting this process together with colleagues from RUSI and Green Acre. So this is something new that Manival is doing this year. They also have, to some extent, some communication and outreach to civil society, but that's not formalized. It's not very formal as the process on the FATF level. So that's something to work on, for example, and they coordinate to some extent with other Council of Europe bodies. We'll see from some examples later in the workshop how that worked in some situations, especially in Serbia. Now, for the recommendation 8, just a quick recap what it requires governments to do about the non-profit sector and civil society sector. The countries should review their legal framework, adequacy of their laws and regulation that relate to non-profit organizations, for which the country has identified are vulnerable to terrorist financing abuse. And then countries should apply focused and proportionate measures in line with the risk-based approach to those non-profit organizations to protect them from terrorist financing abuse. So there are a couple of things countries should do. In a nutshell, it consists of 4 steps. One is to conduct a risk assessment. So which non-profit organizations are actually at risk of terrorist abuse? Not all of them are at risk, only a few. And we'll hear some examples today about how that was done in Kosovo and North Macedonia. Second, to review the existing measures and laws that exist in the country, legal framework that exists, and every other measure that exists, including self-regulatory measures from our sector, how these measures address the risks. Third, if the gaps are found, so if there is a need for any new measure, for new development, then to develop new measures, new laws, new policies to mitigate the risks that must be proportionate and do not restrict operations of legitimate organizations. And then step number 4 is actually the overarching one. All the results, all the measures, all the legislation, all the policies need to be consistent with countries' obligations under international law, human rights, humanitarian law. And throughout all of these processes, the countries are actually required by the FATF standards to conduct outreach to non-profit sector throughout all of these processes. We'll see in practice how that was done or not done in our region. Just to shortly explain what is the risk-based approach. Risk-based approach actually requires country to identify, assess, and understand what are the risks in a particular sector, and then to ensure that these particular risks have been mitigated effectively. Now, for the effectiveness part, specifically for the nonprofit sector, the FATF requires countries and asks them actually to what extent, without disrupting legitimate NPO activities, has the country implemented targeted approach, outreach, and oversight of the nonprofit sector. So there must be targeted approach, there must be outreach, and then oversight for those nonprofit organizations that are at risk of terrorist abuse. Again, not all nonprofit organizations, so no one size fits all, but those that are at risk. What that actually translates as principles, when we extract from the standards what that really means in practice, that really means in practice three main things. One is there is no one size fits all regulation or measures. That's not an effective way to deal with terrorist financing abuse. And it's very likely that this will disrupt and restrict legitimate organization activities, as we've seen as examples in many of these countries in our region. Second, there needs to be a respect of fundamental freedoms. So any law, any measure must respect obligations, freedom of association, assembly, expression, religion of belief, and any international humanitarian law. And third, there must be outreach. So countries and governments should work with nonprofit sector, with civil society, to develop all of these measures and practices and to discuss with them issues about risks, about perception of risks, about potential vulnerabilities, and so on. We'll see how that's done or not done in some of the countries in our region. There's also a quote here you can use for these purposes that I just explained that's useful when discussing these issues with the governments as well. And just on a short note, what meaningful engagement actually means in these processes. So when countries conduct risk assessment process, for example, if they do national risk assessment or specific sector risk assessment for civil society, they should involve organizations. They should have targeted approach and measures and discuss these with organizations. And any concerns of the risk should be discussed with organizations. When countries are being evaluated by FATF or Moneyval, again, they should prepare with organizations discussions about perception of the risks that nonprofit sector will likely discuss with the evaluators and the effectiveness of current measures at play. And then after the country has been evaluated, when the report is out and there are certain recommendations in the report what the country should do next, this should also involve nonprofit sector. There should be discussions with the nonprofit sector on how to implement any kind of additional measures and recommendations from Moneyval or from the FATF. Some good practice examples, you're here today. You're here also some bad practice examples, but we need to know that good practices do exist and we want to learn from them and showcase them to other countries as well. So from the region, North Macedonia and Kosovo, you'll hear some good practice on risk assessment, collaborative efforts. In the Netherlands, there's continuous dialogue with civil society in the preparation for evaluation that's upcoming this year, and colleagues from Netherlands can speak to that. In Germany, there was a good example of civil society doing their own kind of shadow risk assessment report, and that was complementary to the government efforts, to the government report. And the government in Germany actually took a lot of information and actual recommendations from this civil society report and embedded it into their own risk assessment report for the purposes of protecting the sector. And then finally, on a final note, the FATF is opening up more in the last years to the engagement with civil society. We have to say that, you know, we like to think this is due to the persistent advocacy efforts of the global coalition. So they have opened up a possibility for any organization to contact them ahead of the evaluation and raise concerns about the implementation of these laws and regulation, also raising concerns about restrictions. There's also a new effort, a new work stream of the FATF, a new work group that will look into the unintended consequences of these standards for civil society specifically. This is in the preparations now, and we hope it's going to be operational in the next couple of months. So we'll work with the FATF on that as well, to raise concerns about overregulation, especially in this region as well. There are numerous other resources that you can use. You can check out the briefer that we did on how to push back on the different overregulation. This was unfortunately inspired by the situation in Serbia that you'll hear more about today. And then there's also a resource on the website of the Global NPO Coalition that you can find different materials and different examples of various practices. I'll stop here, won't take too much time. Happy to discuss further about these developments, and then also happy to discuss what we as a regional effort can do in furthering this advocacy on various regional levels, whether it's Council of Europe or even European Union. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vanya. Thank you. In fact, your presentation gives lots of meat for thought, I believe it gives a very good basis for the following up discussion. Some of the information that you share as part of our assessment, at least here in Albania, it's totally missing in the country. So this is the very first time in the last month that we have been able to share through the workshops, and hopefully for the upcoming weeks also in a more organized way as part of our campaign. And as you mentioned, it's very important to understand that there is still, although these processes sound very complex, there is still space and a role for NPOs to participate and influence these legal initiatives taken by the national governments in response to Moneyval recommendations. And also it's good to know that also thanks to the work of civil society representatives through participation in this task force, like is your case, Vanya, there is increased sensitivity even at Fatf and Moneyval about the potential consequences that such actions by national government can have in operations of civil society. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. Before we move on with the country presentations from all the Balkan countries and Turkey, it is not in the agenda, but I'll take the opportunity to open the floor if there is any question at this point for the speakers and presenters. You can always ask questions after the country presentations, but if there is any at this point, please feel free to ask. No? Okay. You can always, as I said, use the time after the presentations. At this point, I'll give the floor to Clotilda Tavani, as I announced, the Director of Programs at Partners Albania, to facilitate the second half of the workshop. So, Claudie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yuli. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Do you hear me well? Good. Okay, I'm very pleased to moderate this session of the workshop in which we will have the opportunity to hear and discuss about some of the initiatives. Just a moment, please. Okay, sorry for this. As Julie mentioned, and I was saying during this second session of this event, we will have the opportunity to hear and discuss about some of the initiatives of civil society organizations in the Western Balkan countries and Turkey with regard to AML CFT issues. And we have our distinguished colleagues from civil society organizations that will make their presentations on the specific initiatives in their respective countries. And then we will open the floor for questions and discussions from other participants and other organizations that might have been involved or have the need for more information and knowledge with regards to these issues. Without further ado, I have the pleasure to give the floor to our first speaker coming from North Macedonia. We will start with our colleagues from Connect Association in North Macedonia. As these days, the government in North Macedonia will officially adopt the NPO specific terrorist financing risk assessment. It is a document of almost 100 pages that was developed in an inclusionary and consultative process. As a result of this process, NPOs and institutions developed strategic partnership between them for upscaling the system. The lessons learned from this process will be presented today for us by Viktor Mirchevsky, Program Director at Connect Association, which is the organization that coordinated the process of the NPO risk assessment in North Macedonia. Viktor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for that introduction. It's so bombastic, actually. I think we only have the first step of the overall process. I guess you can hear me and see me well. I'm Viktor Mirchevsky. I'm coming from North Macedonia, from Association Connect that is focused on corporate social responsibility and philanthropy. 5 years ago, we started to manage and to develop a philanthropy online platform. And 4 banks refused us because we were of high risk. That's how the story began in North Macedonia. That's how we approach GCNL about this particular de-risking problem that we had. In my presentation, I would like to overline the state of play in North Macedonia to see how the before and after situation is at the moment, to explain a little bit about the process and the activities that we had, and to share actually advice from practice. I have coordinated the process. It's not an easy one, and it's really a long-term obligation. So I'm happy to share the knowledge and also to learn from the discussion afterwards. So this is the before and after situation. In 2019, we had National Risk Assessment, official state risk assessment, which identified the general risk for financing of terrorism as low to medium, but the risk for the NPO sector as medium. Not very much analytics, not very much information, and use of the old version of recommendation 8. Marina explained this problem actually. Sometimes in Balkans, good news travel very slow. So one of the key learnings from the whole process is to promote the new 2016 version of the recommendation 8. I'm very happy for your video, Claudia. I think we can share it also in Macedonia, especially you have it on Albanian also, so that's great. So now we have an NPO-specific terrorist financing risk assessment, which is conducted in collaborative approach. It defines what are the actually NPO subset, which of them are compliant to the definition of Fatf, and only 13 of them are with low to medium risk because they may be exposed to the risk factors. The risk factors are NPO to be managed or be infiltrated by individuals with radical religious ideology, to operate in the regions of high risk within geographically high risk within North Macedonia, or to have sponsorship and donations to and from abroad related to countries with high risk, or not to have any verifiable data for a financial transaction provided to the institution. So actually from a situation when we have baseline of a medium risk, now we have really specific subset of NPOs who have low to medium risk, and the rest of the sector is considered low or no risk at all. It was conducted in an inclusionary consultative process, for which I will explain in the next slide. The before situation also had non-existent mechanism for dialogue between and inclusion of NPOs within the system of AML and terrorist financing. But now we have actually obligation to do so within the strategy for terrorist combative of terrorism in North Macedonia. Before also we have lack of knowledge and understanding within the civil society sector. Not a lot of NPOs knew about these international developments, but now a lot of them know. We had a vast intervention in capacity building, in discussion with the CSOs, and we have involved actually our network for financial sustainability of CSO, which has over 100 CSO within. This is a quote which is also striking. It came from a compliance officer from a bank, officially stating that the NPO sector in North Macedonia is mystic, non-transparent, and completely out of state control. We were talking about prejudice a lot in this process, but now we have actually strategic cooperation with the Macedonian Banking Association and the National Bank. Are quite well knowledge about the issue, and we have established an initiative for de-risking, and they have shared some practices with colleagues from Netherlands. So I guess we are on a good way, but this is the starting point of the process. So what were the activities in North Macedonia? First of all, we begin with building the core NPO coalition that will be interested to work on the issue. You cannot do it alone. Of course, you need support from the sector. ECNL, thank you very much for the support in this program and sharing your expert knowledge within the expert hub. We started with mapping of CSOs and understanding the overall NPO sector in order to provide the expertise to understand what constitutes NPOs in North Macedonia and in compliance with the definition. Then we have the whole process of coordinated NPO risk assessment, which was conducted by a working group, which has 14 organizational member institutions mainly, and half were from the NPO sector. We had inherent residual risk assessment. We used Greenard methodology supported by GIZ and ECNL. Of course, a vast data collection process, be aware of that in the process, a lot of survey, legal analysis, assessment of measures, etc. In parallel, we're working on education, especially with the NPO institutions and with the banks, which is quite important, and leading and structuring the open dialogue when it comes to policy development and defining the mitigation measures that will be assessed, that will be defined in future. So what are the learnings from this process? Be aware that this is not a project, it is a process. A lot of work and energy should be dedicated. NPOs, yes, should be the leaders, should be the active stakeholder in the whole process, but be aware that it will not end only with the risk assessment or with the intervention or a year-long, let's say, project. Is something that you should follow up and begin the cycle dynamic all over again, especially in line with the mutual evaluation processes in the countries. Change of context is always possible, as we can hear from the Serbian example, so we should be equipped to act immediately if that is needed. Also, this learning from local, regional, and global perspectives are very much important, and we imagine ourselves as the organization that brings the global perspective to the national one. So we keep on informing the institutions of new developments on regional and global level. Within this process, you should very much get know each other and know the stakeholders that are involved in the perspective, institutions, banks, and NPOs. And I must say that you cannot do it previously. The process itself actually enables us to acknowledge the different perspectives and the needs that the different actors have. For instance, institutions have this burden of and responsibility to manage the overall system, and they have high interest about the Fatf process. The mutual evaluation is next year in Macedonia, so that was the entry point, let's say, in the process. We have worked with basically most of the intelligence agency, so be aware about the confidentiality issues and somehow be this bridge of trust between the NPO sector and the institutions. Banks have very much compliance pressure because they are obliged under international policy, under the policies of their mother corporates, and of course under the policy of the something's wrong with my
maybe Victor, do you hear me?
Small technical hiccup. Sorry. Everything it's fine. So banks are have this compliant pressure and also need a formal tools so they can conduct the specific risk-based approach. For instance, in Macedonia, even though NPOs are not obliged entity under the money laundering law, the banks are obliged to have enhanced due diligence for each NPO transaction, and that is something that will be changed in the future. And the risk assessment process was very much helpful in this. But formal tools like sub-classification of the NPOs in the central register is very much important for them. NPOs are diverse. Of course, representation is essential in the process, but also can be very vocal. It can be advantage because we as NPOs can address the problems that the institutions and the bank face within the system and act as this bridge and interlocutor. But at the same time, be aware when you are actually picking organizations that will be directly involved in the process, to avoid the advocacy, but to actually be an expert organizations that are quite prepared to be neutral part of the story, because conspiracy theorists are very interested for everybody, but can bypass the whole process. So Cross-sector cooperation is very much essential for the process, but balancing is really much indeed needed between the two sides, especially between the institutions and the NPOs. We should invest more in knowledge and understanding about recommendation in all sectors. What does it mean really? We must provide possibility to learn from good practice. There are successful banks, there are successful institutions, there are successful NPOs in this story, so we should learn among each other. There's this inconsistency in terminology and interpretation on international and local level. For example, what does control versus supervision means, so be aware about this issue. Connecting different stakeholders and sometimes act as a translator of the languages of different sectors, I think it's very much important, and to nurture this partnership and trust among different actors, because at the end of the day, we all have the same goal: to fight terrorism, to fight misuse of the NPOs. I will leave some space for the other participants, and of course, I'm here to answer all of your questions. Claudia, thank you very much for the allocated time.
Thank you, Victor. I'm sure that there will be questions from other organizations and other countries, as your experience is maybe the first and one of the few experiences when such collaborative processes in the preparation of the NPO risk assessment is conducted. And we in Albania are about to embark soon in this process. And thank you for sharing your lessons learned. And I think they will be useful to us to build an effective process in this regard. So thank you again for your presentation. And when we come to the discussion part, we can you can share more and we can learn more about that process. I'd like to move now with the agenda. We'll go to Albania. As Julie mentioned in her speech at the beginning of the event, we started our efforts with regards to AML CFT issues with the conduction of a mapping and analysis of the legal and regulatory framework on this issue and their impact on NPO sector in the country. Some of the main findings and recommendations from this analysis will be presented today by Advocate Ardiana Shehi, the legal expert that was engaged by Partners Albania for the conduction of the analysis. Advocate Shehi is a member of Albanian Bar Association and International Bar Association. She has practiced commercial law for almost 25 years, especially in tax law, banking, and finance, including the issues that we are discussing today. Advocate Shehi has an extensive professional experience also with the NPO sector. She has contributed in law drafting, training, advocacy, and has published several articles related to NPO sector. Her academic experience includes also teaching at the Albanian School of Magistrates, and Shehi has authored several articles and books on various legal matters published in domestic and foreign publications. Ardiana, the floor is yours.
Dear participants, thank you for participating in this workshop. Dear organizers, thank you for making possible this event. For today, I have prepared a presentation, so I'm going to share it with you. As Clotilda mentioned, and it is written in the agenda, I'm going to present to you the assessment of compliance of Albanian legislation with Recommendation 8, So just to give a bit of information about our report, the assessment of the Albanian anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism legislation and the relevant effects to NPO sector in Albania is performed during February-March 2021. So it's quite a recent report. And here in this slide, I would like to recall some of the international acts that require the compliance for Albania.
Ariana,
Matters.
could you please open the full presentation so that we can...
Yeah, sorry about that.
Thank you.
So for the ones who do not know, Albania is a member of the Council of Europe since 1996. And then in 2006, Albania has ratified the Convention of the Council of Europe on laundering, search, capture, and confiscation of the crime proceeds and financing of terrorism. Also, Albania is part of other international conventions and treaties and agreements, and these are the main legal international acts that oblige Albania to be compliant with the relevant requirements. So, of course, while conducting the assessment, there were a lot of challenges, and one of the challenges was not only the screening of all the relevant existing legislation, but most of all, as you may know, the public interest of anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism competes with the public interest of independent and free activity of the NPO sector. So this was the main challenge. And of course, the effective balance between these two competing public interests is difficult to be achieved, and therefore it has been also a challenge for us while we assessed the legislation. And while aiming this balance, the measures aiming effective anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism tend to prevail over the public interest for an independent NPO sector. The assessment have followed the flow of unlawful money and assets incoming to or generated in Albania and the change of actions until these unlawful or illicit money and assets are monitored, identified, investigated, captured, seized, and confiscated. So for purposes of the presentation to you, here in this slide, I have explained what is the logic of the assessment. So first, I'm going to present to you the requirement as per recommendation 8, and then the findings from the assessment of Albanian legislation, and then the relevant recommendations which have aimed to maximize the required level of compliance. So just to recall to everyone the objectives and general principles of recommendation 8, as stated in the interpretative notes of recommendation 8. So the core legislation that has been subject to our assessment have been the legislation related to anti-money laundering and the combating of the financing of terrorism. And here we have assessed not only the law, the main basic law, but also the secondary legislation. We have assessed the regulation of Bank of Albania, customs legislation, law on ultimate owners, law on register of bank accounts, NPO law and law on registration of NPOs, fiscal legislation, criminal code and code of criminal procedure, law on seizure and confiscation of crime proceeds and assets. Of course, we have considered the relevant provisions and the applicable provisions of the relevant international conventions ratified by Albania and other applicable legal provisions. What have been the main findings? They may look like generic, but following these findings, we have provided also specific recommendations. So the main findings are that from the legal and institutional viewpoint, Albanian anti-money laundering and CFT legislation is fully compliant to the relevant international requirements, and it enables effective monitoring, identification, investigation, capture, and punishment of the related violations. Then the recent approval of the several related laws are compliant to Manival recommendations. So very recently in Albania, it has been approved law on ultimate owners, law on register of bank accounts, and other related laws. The NPOs in Albania are considered as high-risk entities, regardless that today no NPO sector risk assessment have been made. And this is one of the main findings of the assessment. Further measures ought to be taken to maximize balance between the effective implementation of the AML and CFT legislation and the compliance with the recommendation 8 of FATF related to NPO sector. NPO sector, subject to the anti-money laundering and the combating of the financing of terrorism screening, is at risk due to the control from the relevant authorities. The monitoring and control is not risk-based, and to date, no objective criteria or well-defined methodology is approved and implemented. Albanian fiscal legislation provides for some risk indicators that have to be implemented by the tax authorities while controlling and monitoring the activity of the NGOs. On the basis of this fiscal legislation, the tax authorities do have also the right to control the operations of the NPOs, and these have been the main finding of the report. So in this slide, I have presented some of the specific findings, of course, related to some of the basic principles of the interpretive notes of recommendation 8. So the very first one is related to the definition for the NPOs. So the definition, the FATF definition is broader than the definition of the NPO provided by the Albanian NPO law. The other legislation, Albanian legislation, other than NPO legislation, does not provide a specific definition for purposes of anti-money laundering and combating financing of terrorism purposes. So I'm not going to present right now what are the specific recommendations, because I have summarized all this for purposes of time, and I'm going to present this to you at the very end of this presentation, but I will follow with these specific findings. Another finding is related to the principal risk-based approach applying focused measures. So our finding that derived from our assessment is that Albanian legislation provides for measures to control activity of NPOs. The secondary legislation provides for several risk indicators applicable to NPOs. There are no clear objectives criteria and well-defined risk-based methodology. Tax authorities are vested with powers to control operational activity of NPOs for anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism purposes. Other specific findings, so related to the principle of recommendation 8, flexibility in developing a national response to terrorist financing abuse of NPOs to face the changing nature of the terrorist financing threat, we have already identified that the existing Albanian legislation allows flexibility to respond to any terrorist financing abuse. Albania makes efforts to follow all anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism international developments. Then when it comes to the other basic principle, countries are required to identify and take effective and proportionate actions against NPOs that are exploited by or supporting terrorists or terrorist organizations, taking into account the specifics of the case. Our finding is that our legislation provides good legal basis to follow, investigate any related violation by the NPOs. Our legislation does not comfort proportionate actions against NPOs. And in summary, of course, we have provided in the report also other findings related to other basic principles of recommendation number 8. But we can summarize that the status of compliance of all the recommendations of all the basic principles of recommendation 8 is partly compliant. Then I will follow with the measures. As I explained at the very beginning, the presentation, the structure of this presentation follows the structure of interpretive notes of recommendation 8. So now I'm going to the measures. So as any one of you is aware, so the interpretive notes provides that the measures represent examples of specific actions that the state should undertake to defend NPOs from the potential abuse from terrorist financing. And in this other slide, I have summarized what are the findings related to these measures. So regarding the first measure, there is a sustained outreach regarding terrorist financing matters in Albania. However, there is an immediate need for more transparency from the state authorities that implement the NPO laws, legislation and cross-sector anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism legislation. When it comes to the second measure, the related to targeted risk-based supervision or monitoring of NPOs, our finding is that the activity of the NPO sector in Albania should be transparent to the public to allow the external actors to exercise a certain level of monitoring. Supervision and monitoring of NPOs by state authorities should be based on objective criteria and well-defined risk-based methodology. When it comes to the third measure, from the strict legal viewpoint, the relevant authorities, tax authorities, criminal law enforcement authorities have the necessary legal powers to investigate effectively NPOs suspected or used by terrorist activities or that support terrorist organizations. Regarding the fourth measure, as stated in the interpretative note of recommendation 8, from the strict legal viewpoint, Albania has potentials to respond to international requests for information about an NPO of concern. However, Albania is identifying appropriate points of contact and procedures to respond to international requests for information regarding particular NPOs suspected of terrorist financing or involvement in other forms of terrorist support. One of our findings is also that there is a need to employ personnel who know the NPO sector and the particularities of the daily activities of the NPOs. So while trying to qualify the status of compliance regarding the measures, this is partly compliant. And then the final findings, which is related to the resources for supervision, monitoring, and investigation, as provided in the notes of recommendation number 8. The main finding is that regarding the relevant human capacities, the expertise and competence of the authorities during the recent years, efforts have been made to improve and strengthen the relevant capacities and to support these authorities with adequate financial, human, and technical resources, but none of these authorities have specialized corps to understand the particularities of the NPO sector and their daily activities, and who are aware about the role of the NPOs in Albania, their rights, and the relevant guarantees available to NPOs. Status of compliance is partly compliant. Which are the main recommendations that have derived from our assessment? So given that Albanian legislation and the institutional framework complies to the main anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism international standards, but it is not fully compliant to recommendation 8 related to NPO sector, the below recommendations ought to be followed. First of all, there is an immediate need to perform an NPO risk assessment in Albania, which will guide also to the approval of an effective risk-based methodology. Albanian legislation needs to be amended to provide a new functional definition for purposes of anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism and compliance to recommendation number 8. The related legislation ought to use the new functional definition for anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism purposes. Then the other recommendation is that there is a need to amend the legislation regarding the risk-based methodologies applicable to the NPO sector, aiming to guarantee the approval and implementation of proportional measures and adequate to the NPO sector. Criteria and the methodology of risk assessment ought to be provided in compliance with the FATF recommendation 8, which aimed clear objective criteria to avoid abuse of power over the NPOs. The other main recommendations are that there is a need to shift the competence of operational control over the NPOs from the tax authorities to the specialized structures of the relevant authorities. So the main anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism directorate in Albania. The role of the tax authorities ought to be limited to the reporting tasks to these authorities, so to the directorate. It is required better transparency and accountability from the state authorities that implement and are related to the implementation of the NPO law. Then there is a need to identify the contact points and the proper procedures for capacity building to respond to international requirements for information on certain NPOs. And the last main recommendation is that there is a need to improve the capacities of the authorities vested with powers related to anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism, with employees who know the NPO sector and are aware of the particularities of the activities of the NPOs. So these are the main findings and the main recommendations. As I said, in the report, we have already stated also some specific recommendations for improvements in the legislation. So we have identified the specific laws, the specific provisions that need to be amended accordingly. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ardiana, for the presentation. As you actually mentioned at the beginning, the report will be finalized during April. We will prepare it in Albanian and English language, and we'll share it. So for everyone that will be interested, we'll share it with you for further information on the findings and recommendations. And I would like to emphasize one of the main findings that Ardiana also mentions. The most pressing, I would say, issue for the moment now here is the fact that all NPOs are considered as high risky in Albania, and all the measures taken so far are based on these assumptions. So as I said, very soon what is needed is the NPO risk assessment that will be conducted very soon, and hopefully this will show to the government what are the sections of NPOs that are really vulnerable toward anti-money money laundering and financing of terrorism, and will also serve to them so that they could take proportionate and effective measures that would target these specific NPOs and not the all of the sector. Now we will move to our next distinguished speaker and colleague from the region. We have with us in this workshop Dardan Kryeziu from Civicos in Kosovo, that will share with us the experience in the multi-stakeholder dialogue of NPOs banking sector and the state in making financial flows secure and available. Dardan is a project director at Civicos, which is a platform of more than 260 civil society organizations in Kosovo, which is established to create and promote an enabling environment for cooperation of formal civil society sector and state institutions of Kosovo. Dardan is responsible to coordinate the process of cooperation between civil society and the government in Kosovo and manage the USAID project, transparent, effective, and accountable municipalities in the organization. Dardan has been engaged in AML policies and the impact on civil society in Kosovo since 2014. He was part of the working group on conducting sectoral risk assessment in Kosovo, and since then have been advocating on solving the problems that the NGOs are facing with private banks in Kosovo. Dardan, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Clotilda. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with all of you and to listen all of these presentations and to see the experiences that our neighbor countries are facing. And I must say that listening from other colleagues, we have quite a similar situation in Kosovo as well, and I see that there are a lot of similarities when it comes to all the measures that other countries have as well. I didn't prepare a presentations, but I'm going to be short, and I'm going to share with you a short history of our engagement as a Civicos and as a civil society in all AML policies in Kosovo, and also I'm going to share our experience being part of the working group on conducting the sectorial risk assessment in Kosovo. For first time, we as a Civicos and as a civil society in Kosovo in general, we were informed that in Kosovo we have the law on anti-money laundering and financing terrorism, that also NGOs are reporting entities and have obligations towards this law. It was 2015 where we informed about the obligations that we have towards the law, that no one in Kosovo knew that NGOs have these obligations towards the anti-money laundering and preventing financing terrorism law. In that time, we kind of alarmed about the obligations that all NGOs have and the penalties that exist if you didn't fulfill these obligations. We, together with other organizations, we got the law, and we saw that their NGOs are treated same like corporates, banks, casinos, and all other entities in Kosovo. And some of the obligations in that time in that law were that any fund that you receive in NGO, you should ask permission to Financial Intelligence Unit, and Financial Intelligence Unit have 1 week to treat your request and to allow to receive the money. So it was not mentioned from where you have to receive the money. It can be European Commission or US Embassy that are not for sure institutions that potentially can finance the terrorism, but doesn't matter. You have to ask permission, even if you receive a small grant, like 1,000 euro, 2,000 euro, doesn't, it's not the amount of money, but you have to ask permission from Financial Intelligence Unit, and then they should approve, and then the donor can transfer the money to your bank account. And if you didn't fulfill this kind of obligation, the penalties were not with money, but with jail. You know, and we get alarmed in that time, and we said to the institutions that, listen, all 10,000 NGOs in Kosovo that are officially registered can go in jail if the state will implement this law toward the NGOs. And in that time, we started the procedure together with Ministry of Finance to amend this law and to change. So it was the first time that we engaged on this topic. And for sure, I want to thank ECNL that since that time and now is supporting us as a Civicos and also as a civil society in Kosovo to work with institutions. In that time, it was not that much hard to convince Ministry of Finance and Financial Intelligence Unit, because we have a long history of cooperation with public institutions. Civicos, as the biggest network, it's officially working with the government. We have a common strategy with the government, which are a few topics that we work, which are in interest of civil society. So in 2016, the law changed, and we mostly removed all these kind of restrictions, but still remained a few restrictions, and NGOs still are reporting entities in the law, but not with all other restrictions that were in the previous law. In 2018, it was for first time that Ministry of Finance, Financial Intelligence Unit, supported by EU program, they started to conduct the first sectorial risk assessment in Kosovo. And it was engaged a EU company together with the local organizations. They developed the methodology, and they also collected the data on sectorial risk assessment on anti-money laundering and financing terrorism. We were invited in a later stage in this working group, after they developed the methodology and they collected the data. So we were not part of developing the methodology together with institutions, but we were invited when they presented the first draft of this sectorial risk assessment. And also in that time, we were supported by ECNL. And I was personally part of this working group, where all relevant institutions were Kosovo Police, Tax Administration, religious entities, customs, and all relevant institutions were part of the working group. And I was the only one from civil society as a representative in that working group. When we saw the first draft, we saw that institutions, the measures that they proposed towards the findings that they were not with reality of the work of civil society in Kosovo. And this was mostly institutions in general, they don't understand the sector. They don't know so much for the sector. They mostly have some prejudices about this sector, and the measures that they proposed, they were not proportional, but they were also outside of the reality. What we did in that meeting, I used 2-3 examples that why these measures that they proposed are not with reality. And the good thing was that our approach towards institutions was that, listen, we as a Civicos, or we as a civil society that working on this field, we are interested as much as you as institutions to not allow organizations to misuse the NGOs to finance terrorism or do money laundering, you know. So this was the first thing that we convinced them, that we are not here to protect NGOs and to say, listen, you as a state, you should not oversee the NGOs, and they can do whatever they want in terms of financing terrorism. But we said that we should be partner on this, and we are interested as much as you on this field. And I took 2-3 examples in the working group that the measures that you proposed are not going to work in reality because they are outside of the sector. And after 2-3 examples that I took, for example, it was also representative of Kosovo police that also they said he's right, because Kosovo police, for example, they proposed one of the measures that they proposed in this sectorial risk assessment was that Kosovo police should go in all municipalities where NGOs works to check if organizations are doing something wrong, or if these organizations who are doing kind of, let's say, a seminar or activity, to go and to check what is the topic of this seminar. And also the police said, listen, we don't do this because we only go if we have any invitation, if something criminal is happening or something wrong is happening, then we go and intervene and arrest someone, but we don't go to check the topic of the organizations, what they are doing in XY municipalities. So in that time, when we said this kind of arguments, we decided in that day, because in that working group meeting, it was supposed that these sectorial risk assessments to be approved and sent to the government. Then what we did as a Civicus, I proposed that you should give us more time to elaborate all the proposed measures that you proposed in this draft document. And then after a week, we will come with concrete recommendations to change this kind of measures. And what I did personally, and as a Civicus, after that, they agreed to postpone the approval of this risk assessment. We went and I invited more than 10 organizations that are most active in Kosovo and know the topic. And also ECNL supported us with concrete recommendations. And we prepared for each measure, we prepared recommendations based on the reality of the work of civil society. And in the next meeting, I presented all these recommendations from us. And I must say that 95% of the recommendations that we proposed, they accepted, and they were included in the draft. So this was a good example of how cooperation with NGOs can bring a document which is related to the reality of the work of the civil society, because the first draft with measures that they proposed, they were not implemented measures. They proposed that based on prejudices that they have for civil society organizations. And this was the first kind of battle that we won as a civil society. And the last draft that they sent to the government, it was all the proposed measures were coming from civil society as a group. So we as a Civicus, we coordinated this activity in the working group. So this was for the first sectorial risk assessment that was conducted in Kosovo. Then later in that year, UNDP conducted a national risk assessment, which civil society for sure was not part of this working group, and we didn't know so much how they did and what they did. But just a few weeks ago, I received because now we have very good cooperation with Financial Intelligence Unit, and they invite us in every meeting and every activity which is related to civil society, because they saw that civil society also is interested to not allow the sector to abuse on financing terrorism and money laundering, because before they saw civil society kind of opposite. They think that civil society wants to misuse the sector on money laundering and financing terrorism, and they as institutions don't, but they saw that we are also good partners and we want together to regulate this issue. So they shared with us the recommendations for NPO sector, and still I must say I was not so much satisfied when I saw the recommendations, because they said that NPO sector in Kosovo, it's medium risk on money laundering and high risk on financing terrorism. And this is because they don't understand so much financing terrorism and promoting radical, radical activities, because there is a difference. In Kosovo, there was no single case that an NPO was engaged on financing terrorism. But there are few cases in Kosovo that in the name of NGOs, they misused the mission of the organizations and they promoted some radical activities. For example, there was an NGO founded from East countries that in the mission, they had to maybe provide computer courses, IT courses for young people. But what they did with the young people, they promoted some maybe radical religious activities on that time. So there are only few cases in Kosovo that they maybe NGOs misused and promoted only this kind of radical activities, but there was no single case that they financed terrorism, you know, like from Kosovo to send money in Syria or wherever. But institutions, they understand because of these cases, they think that NPO sector is vulnerable when it comes to financing terrorism. So this recommendation still is there. This is when it comes to national risk assessment. And another engagement that we have with the support of ECNL is working with the banks. NGOs in Kosovo are facing with a lot of problems with private banks. Still the private banks, because of this AML law and central bank have their own regulation that NGOs are treated same like private companies and other corporates. They don't understand that in NGO, if you are the founder, your founder name will for sure stay in the statute of the NGO, and you will not change the founder. You can change the board, you can change the members of the NGO, or you can change the director and management, but the founders will remain always in the statute. And we have the cases, for example, we as a Civicos, a few founders are not active anymore in civil society. Another founder was dead. So when we want to open a new bank account, they ask from us the list of the founders to be also present physically in the bank. And we explain that, listen, we have the board. The founders are not part of the NGO anymore. They're just part of the history of the organization. They founded the organization in 2007, and they are not anymore engaged or doesn't have any position in the NGOs, but still all the NGOs in Kosovo were facing this kind of problems. And then later it was that they closed the bank accounts without any notifications, they freeze the funds. So all these issues, we started to work with central bank and other institutions with the support of ECNL. And we prepared concrete recommendations, and later we became part of the working group to change the administrative instructions. And now the situation started to change. Banks started to understand how civil society is working, who is the governing body of the CSOs. And this is another success that we have with ECNL, but still some private banks still have some requests that are not in line with the reality how CSOs are working.
Erdem, thank you. Thank you very much for your detailed presentation and for sharing with us some concrete examples of the success that the intervention and the efforts of the NPOs have had in your case. Actually, they were also examples that show that the benefits of the collaborative processes, and also in terms of making the state institution, the administration, government, and also the banking sector aware about the operation of NPOs. And I hope that these processes continue. As you mentioned, you now have a very good collaboration with the financial unit in Kosovo, and once again, thank you. And I think that these examples are very hopeful, even for other countries where such processes are not yet being implemented.
And just to mention that now, just a week ago, we organized together with FIU to collect the data for this regional assessment that is happening. I think a lot of organizations are part of this process, which is led by Council of Europe. So FIU invited us that we should lead this process of collecting data from NGOs in Kosovo, and then together we will send all these data to Council of Europe for this regional risk assessment. So kind of we became a partner with FIU when it comes to this topic. They don't do anything when it comes to the NPO sector without consulting us or inviting us, because as I said before, they don't have so much knowledge and information for civil society, and now they have trust on our work, what we do.
Yeah. Thank you, Dardan. I'm sure that we will have the opportunity to discuss and hear more during the last session from other participants. Yes. That might have questions on your presentation. We are a bit behind with the time, so I would move quickly to our next speaker. We are moving to our colleagues in Serbia. Bojana from Civic Initiative will share with us the list case in Serbia. Maybe some of you have heard about this case, which I can say is a concrete example of how the government are misusing the Fatf and money value recommendations to intimidate civil society organizations and media representatives. To tell us more about this issue and the coordinated efforts of NPOs to push back this effort, as I said, we have with us Bojana from Civic Initiative. Civic Initiative is an organization that operates to promote and strengthen civic education and citizens' participation in Serbia. Bojana serves as a program director at the organization. She is also a board member of Balkan Civil Society Development Network. She has been active in the civil society sector since 2001 as an activist, volunteer, and as an expert, and has initiated and participated in several campaigns for raising awareness and public advocacy on the national and local level. Bojana, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. I hope you can hear me and you can see a few slides that I have prepared.
Yes.
I have a problem now with the with the scrolling. Well, yes, we agree that I will talk about the case, about the case, the list. I'm pretty convinced that most of you are aware about it, and now after, I don't know, 9 or 10 months after that action led by our department for anti-money laundering in Serbia, now we can see also some concrete consequences related to both data that were gathered or our strong reaction as a civil society. So I won't go into details regarding the framework in Serbia. I just wanted to share several points about our previous efforts related to this framework before the list in July last year. So civil society organizations in Serbia indeed were very active in awareness raising among the sector in terms of potential abuses for financing terrorism. And we had several concrete joint activities with the government and with a joint coordination body established by the government, which was in charge of implementation of all FATF recommendations in Serbia. And their specific part related to NPOs also initiated communication with us and other organizations when they prepared the framework related to the recommendation number 8. In that regard, in Serbia, we have a law on anti-money laundering and countering financing terrorism, but NPOs are not reporting entities, which is definitely good for us. Only as indirect beneficiaries, for example, when we are banks clients or we are using some other services which are covered by the law, then we can talk about the obligations. Beside that, there is a framework of monitoring of NPOs based on recommendation number 8 and established criteria in the line with international recommendations. We are aware of it, and we heard for some, of course, inspection activities in that regard. And it started in 2019 for those 2 years, previous two years, let's say that. We did not hear for any strong problems or issues or sanctions towards civil society organizations based on that framework. Then, of course, we had numerous joint activities with our administration for anti-money laundering, and before the list, we organized joint trainings. We were promoting their documents into civil society organizations, and the idea was to continue the cooperation and to take part in a new risk assessment, which was planned for this year. Unfortunately, the list definitely change our relations with the entire government. Of course, we were advocating for improving legal framework in Serbia in order to tackle transparency of civil society organizations. For example, law on Serbian Business Register Agency do not provide data about the founders. Not publicly, those data are not publicly available, although, of course, we are obliged to send it to them during establishing the organization. That could be one kind of addressing some of recommendations for Serbia. And of course, we all are aware about the lack of self-regulation mechanisms in Serbia, which could be also very useful in this regard. And we had some efforts aimed on establishing some system some specific groups of organizations in Serbia already did something. For example, for youth sector, we have standards for youth organizations. Then we as civic initiatives started with the ethical code for CSOs in 2012. Then Track Foundation developed some standards for organizations who are active in crowdfunding and collecting money from citizens. Catalyst Foundation also launched one platform related to presenting data, financial data of civil society organizations. And now we are implementing some pilot model to, with the help of our colleagues from CNVOs, and in order to explore the possibilities of a broader system of quality assurance standards in Serbia. So to conclude, we had the communication and cooperation with the government and with the anti-money laundering department, and we were very active, especially in raising awareness among civil society organizations of potential abuses. But unfortunately, on July last year, the administration for anti-money laundering sent an official request to all commercial banks in Serbia in order to collect information and documentations related to all existing accounts and transactions for 37 organizations and 20 individuals. That is mistake in my presentation. And what was very interesting, we heard for that case from media, and saw that on that list were media associations, investigative journalists, philanthropic and crowdfunding organizations, CSOs dealing with human rights, especially those who are dealing with the very sensitive topics like dealing with the past, war crimes, then some artistic groups, very credible watchdog human rights and rule of law based organizations in Serbia. And what was common for all of them is that all of us were actually very loud in our criticism of the government or ruling the party activities in Serbia. So later on, I will reflect on the regular system of oversight of NPOs in Serbia and the criteria. Again, I have a problem with. In terms of consequences for those CSOs, definitely we can talk about reputational damage because you know that as in most of countries in the region, we are trying to handle the legacy of 90s and that narrative about CSOs as foreign mercenaries, and now this kind of discreditation just improved that kind of existing narrative among the wider public. Then when it comes to investigative media, their role is so important, especially in the conditions of captured state, a lot of problems with all aspects of democracy and institutions integrity. and they were already a subject of numerous smear campaigns led by different state officials or other informal centers of power very close to the ruling party. And public support was actually the only defense for independent journalists and media from that kind of negative campaign. Then, of course, organizations, similar is for the organizations dealing with the past and war crimes, because topics which they are covering are the most difficult topics in Serbian society now. And in that way, the already weak support of the general public definitely collapses in the conditions of a growing populist and national narratives. Then, very soon after this this situation, we saw new problems with the banks, similar to Kosovo. Dardan already mentioned. In Serbia, we had similar problems when it comes to NPO status as a bank's clients. You know, a lack of recognizing a specific legal nature of CSOs, and this situation with founders is one of the most common issues here in Serbia. But after this situation, we definitely saw that some banks definitely changed the client reputational risk for the organizations or individuals related to them after this demand of the administration for anti-money laundering. The most of organizations and individuals that were on the list, as I said, were human rights based organizations or investigative journalists, etc. And all of them had similar experiences in the past, as I said, with smear campaigns, targeting, etc. But now we saw for the first time philanthropic organizations as a subject of this kind of collecting of information. Of course, civil society who are providing services for the citizens definitely had a lot of problems to explain what does it mean, because in the public, the messages that were sent by both government and administration for anti-money laundering were very confused. And of course, they used this situation to strengthen a negative narrative about us. And the main message that was sent was, so what do you want? You want to be out of control. You have to respect the laws, the legal framework of Serbia. And if you are fine, then it is not a problem for you to be controlled. So use this situation and messages for further discreditation of the organizations that were on the list. So in terms of our response, the main point is that this action of the anti-money laundering administration was not clear in terms of existing legal framework. So first, of course, we send numerous requests based on our legal framework in order to provide answers on following questions. Based on which criteria was the list from that letter sent to all banks in Serbia? Based on whose order did the administration send this letter to banks? Because they referred to specific article of the law on the prevention of money laundering. But that article also says that it is possible, to collect that kind of information, but if there is a reasonable doubt for collecting those information. In the practice, that means that if there are some legal actions against us, led by police or prosecution or the court, then they can ask the administration to send them that kind of data, and then the administration can ask that from the banks. We also wanted to know how will the information in this way will be further proceeded. And of course, our preliminary investigative or other legal procedures conducted against individuals and organizations. And that was a real confusion when it comes to explanations from the side of the administration in media and at the public event held on October, when director of the administration came, and definitely was very clear that they actually use this specific article because they didn't have any other legal opportunity to collect data for some kind of strategic analysis as a first step within the process of new risk assessment. It was so funny. Our colleague Vanya, who was included and involved in all our activities, also was surprised. We got information that kind of practice, that specific, a step of collecting data and conducting some kind of strategic analysis is not a part of usual practice anywhere according to standards. And still, after a lot of months and after when special reporters initiated a mechanism against Serbia and asked official explanation from both the Serbian administration, FATF, and Council of Europe Moneyval, we still do not know what was actually the real reason for this action. Of course, our suspicions, were aimed based on our previous experience, especially with tabloids, that they are using this opportunity to collect data and to actually publish it and to use it in smear campaigns against us. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that yesterday we got a confirmation because our colleagues from the organization CERTA are subject of terrible smear campaign in the parliament. And definitely yesterday, one of MPs used specific information about the grant amount, which was known only for the bank and for the donor. And in order to discredit them, and said that they are, foreign agents, American agents, and that they stole the money. So we can see, we will see definitely in the future, will they use a similar data? But this was actually what was the biggest concerns from the beginning. And of course, I'm finishing. Definitely, with this case, we had a strong support of ECNL. We have a strong joint action and coordination. All organizations that were on the list were involved. We were providing constant media attention, communication with other organizations. We had that one public event with the director, and what is the most important thing, we started and used opportunities to communicate and to inform FATF, Moneyball, special rapporteurs, and now, as far as we know, in April, this will be the subject of Moneyball plenary session, the list, and they will definitely ask more information and clarification from our government. So this is something for the future. Of course, we will continue with all activities, and we will share all experiences and lessons with you.
Thank you very much. I know you have done a lot of efforts and a lot to. But I would now like to leave the floor to Rana Kotan, our last speaker of this day. First, I would like to excuse for this delay in the time. Rana comes from TUSEV organization in Turkey. She is Secretary General of the organization and will share with us the application of Fatf recommendations and its implication on civil society on Turkey. Rana, thank you for joining us and for waiting for us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Claudie. I will share my screen as well. I need to be really quick since we don't have much time left, but yeah. When I was listening to Victor from North Macedonia, and he was talking about before and after situation, I thought that in Turkey we are still in the before stage, because there is a lack of knowledge on the CSO side. There is no mechanism for dialogue, but I will explain all of it. So why we started working on this FATF issue, we first became aware of it last year. We were actually advocating to change the law on aid collection in Turkey, which is pretty problematic. But when we visited the public officials, they said that they have an issue with FATF. And they use this law, namely the law on aid collection, the means to prevent terrorism financing and to control the flow of money. And then we, like all other participants here, we worked with ECNL. We had a workshop with them and we started brainstorming about this issue, and then the law on the preventing financing of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction entered into force on the last day of last year, and we wrote an info note again with support from ECNL. Just a very quick background on the law on aid collection. It's a very old law. It's highly restrictive. You need to have prior permission for each fundraising activity outside of your headquarters. The application is bureaucratic. Evaluation is subject to subjective criteria. This law I mentioned about the weapons of mass destruction, but also includes money laundering, anti-money laundering, and counter-terrorism financing. It was enacted in a fast process, so all of it happened within 2 weeks. The draft law was presented to the General Assembly on December 16, then it was debated on the next weekend. It was approved in the Parliament on December 27 and entered into force December 31st. It was done without any outreach, with no participation from CSO, and the rationale was explained as prevention of terrorism financing, money laundering, and fulfillment of FATF's recommendations. However, this law goes beyond the FATF requirements and it significantly damages freedom of association, and it also includes articles which contradict with Turkish constitution. The law makes changes in 6 separate laws, but the most important changes are regarding the law on associations and the law on aid collection. In terms of the law on aid collection, what is new? Now it is impossible to fundraise online without prior permission. Previously, there was a gray area. Now it doesn't exist anymore. You have to have a permission to be able to fundraise online. And if you violate this article, then you will be subject to disproportionately high penalties. And also aids provided domestically and abroad will be regulated with a bylaw, which still doesn't exist. So we don't know how this will be regulated. What is new on the law of associations? There are a lot of problematic provisions here. The Minister of Interior, with this new amendment, now can suspend the activities of an association without waiting for the court decision. If there is a doubt about terrorism financing. A trustee can be appointed to this association after suspending the activities. The audit of associations will be performed every year by public servants who may not have the adequate experience, because we have more than 120,000 associations and there is not enough skilled personnel available to do the entire audit of those associations. And persons convicted of certain crimes, namely financing terrorism, drug trafficking, money laundering, these people cannot take a role in the management of associations forever, even if they were pardoned. And there are a new set of penalties and sanctions introduced. So there was a huge reaction about this new law. More than 600 signatures were collected in a statement. People protested about it. And TÜSEV's response was a statement that this is wrong and it will lead to shrinking civic space. And we also wrote letters to members of the parliament in order to prevent this law from being passed, but we couldn't, obviously. The law is not in alignment with FATF's recommendation 8, and we believe the new measures will severely restrict civic space and stifle the activities of CSOs. Just to briefly mention Turkey's journey with FATF, we are a member since 1991. In 2013, our membership in Turkey was suspended due to lack of progress. And then this suspension was reversed after Turkey adopted the law on prevention of financing of terrorism. In 2014, there was an on-site visit and sufficient progress was reported. In 2018, there was a national risk assessment performed by the government without the participation of CSOs. And then in 2019, MASAK, which is the Turkish Financial Crimes Investigation Board, they issued a manual, and FATF issued the Mutual Evaluation Turkey report. And in this last report, recommendation 8, which is related with the civil society, it was rated as partially compliant. And after that, as I mentioned, the law on the weapons of mass destruction was enacted in 2020. That is the journey of Turkey. Now, this FATF's mutual evaluation report was referring to the national risk assessment, and there the high vulnerability was detected especially in humanitarian aid associations, which are located close to the conflict zones, because we are very close to Syria and all other zones. So these associations are viewed as greater risk for abuse, as opposed to the rights-based organizations where basically there was no risk. However, the report was criticizing because CSOs did not participate in the national risk assessment, and there is no periodical review of NPO risk. The internal audit focuses on mismanagement and fraud rather than terrorism financing. and the sanctions are reported to be too weak to be effective. These were the main points of the evaluation report, and we were expecting Turkish government to take precautions in order to address these criticisms. However, the law goes beyond this report also, so it's difficult to make a link between this report and the law. I will just very quickly explain how this new law doesn't correspond to FATF recommendations. First of all, recommendation 1 and 8 emphasize that a risk-based approach is applied. However, in this law, there is no risk-based approach because the law takes measures which are not applied to a specific subset of CSOs, but it applies to the entire civil society. For example, there is an obligatory audit for all CSOs and restricting online aid campaigns for all CSOs. These apply to everybody. So it's like a one-size-fits-all approach. Moreover, the national risk assessment is old. It's almost 3 years old now. And we have very little information about how it was conducted, when it was conducted, whether CSOs were involved, which we don't think so. And there are no facilities available for CSOs to voice their concerns and objections. And there is no other risk assessment, a more updated one. We're not aware of that. Secondly, also FATF recommends that measures should not restrict CSOs' access to financial resources, nor the legitimate activities of CSOs. But here in our case, there is no protection for legitimate CSO activity because the changes in the law on aid collection will make fundraising more cumbersome and more difficult. And the law also brings restrictive measures in form of temporary suspension, regular audits, and increased penalties. So it will harm legitimate CSO activity for sure. Also, we don't see proportionate measures to mitigate the TF-related risks because it imposes disproportionately high sanctions, both administrative and criminal. Fines have been introduced. The temporary suspension of CSO activities and indefinite prohibition of persons from the management organs, these are not proportionate measures. We also have concerns about the effectiveness of these measures because making audits for everybody is very cumbersome, and the fact that those audits will be conducted by public officials who may not really have the necessary experience also raises concerns about the efficiency of those audits. And also an important point, there is lack of outreach. It was, no outreach was observed, neither during the preparation of the risk assessment, nor during the drafting of the new law. But it's very important to strengthen the knowledge of CSOs. It's important to prepare guides and organize workshops in order to empower them and protect them against potential abuse and risk. And also there is divergence from international standards in many ways. These law does contradict with international laws, human rights laws, and it also contradicts with certain provisions of Turkish constitution. I was very quick. This is my last slide. So we analyzed the situation. We compared it with the law and the Fatf requirements, and we made suggestions which we will also voice when we visit the public authorities. We made 7 suggestions. Basically, the first one is the risk assessment mechanism should be objective, inclusive, and participatory. And we really probably need to do the risk assessment starting from scratch. Secondly, the risk assessment should involve periodic review and a mechanism for objection. Strengthening CSOs is very important by increasing their know-how and awareness. The evaluation of existing laws is important, and the new law should be amended based on the identified risks and in line with FATF's recommendations. To do all of this, we need to form a working group, like it is the case in many other countries, which will involve different stakeholders to address how to best address the recommendations of the FATF report. All the solutions that will be developed should support the enabling environment for civil society and comply with international human rights law. And lastly, strengthening coordinations among public authorities is essential because we have the impression that there is not much, not a healthy communication between different public authorities who are organizing and planning this process. And also there is a much stronger cooperation needed between state authorities and civil society organizations. So we will start visiting the state authorities, and I hope they will be open to discuss these issues, and they will invite us and the broader civil society to the next stages of this process.
Thank you, Rana. Thank you very much for the presentation. I thank all the speakers for their interesting presentations and for sharing their experiences with us. As we are behind with the time, I would like to start the discussions. Thank you all the participants that have stayed with us still. We already have some questions in the chat box. We have a question from Sanya, which is from, if I'm not wrong, from the Belgrade Center for Security Policy. And it was a question, there were some questions actually directed to Victor from North Macedonia. Victor has already responded to the questions in the chat box, and everybody can see the answer, but if still, Sonia, there is something that you need to know about your questions, please let us know. I'm continuing with another question which is in chat. It is from Sangeta from Human Security Collective. It is addressed to Ardiana. It is a question regarding the recommendation on shifting of NPO operational control from tax authorities to AML authority. Will that not contribute to the further resecuritization of the sector? Ardiana, may you?
So thank you for the question. As I already mentioned during my presentation, according to the Albanian fiscal legislation, this legislation provides for the right of the tax authorities to perform overall operational control over the NGOs. What I meant by saying that it has to be shifted, not necessarily I meant that the anti-money laundering authorities should perform operational control. But what we meant in the recommendation is that the tax authorities ought to remain only a reporting authority, like the other reporting bodies as provided in the anti-money laundering legislation. And while performing the tax for purposes of reporting, they have to identify the cases based on the specific risk-based, well-defined methodology. And after the relevant cases are identified, they have to report it to the Anti-Money Laundering Directorate, and this directorate has to act with these cases as any other case that is reported by the other reporting bodies, such as banks or other reporting entities as provided in our anti-money laundering legislation.
Thank you, Ardiana, for the response to the question. Okay, if anybody else from the participants has something to ask or to add to the discussion, you may raise your hand or you may write in the chat box. Vanya, you have written something. If you want to say it or...
Thank you. I'm just waiting for national level colleagues, for their questions to be answered first, but we do have some regional proposals, yes.
Okay, you can go ahead.
Okay, well, we kind of were thinking through, what are the avenues for regional advocacy. And there are a couple of things that ongoing. One that I think most of you are a part of anyway is a process that is led by TAXO, which is the revision and the new version of the EU guidelines for monitoring enabling environment in accession countries. And there we proposed already to insert a part for future monitoring by this process, a part on the legal framework for anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing and how it reflects on civil society freedoms, on enabling environment, right? So that's one part. I think these discussions are now ongoing and consultation is ongoing or already finished on the national level. We hope that this part will stay as a revision, as a change, and that from the next cycle, the EU in its accession process will pay more attention to these issues. We've already seen last year in the progress reports for the countries in the region, we've already seen in a number of countries that the EU did reflect on some of these issues. I know for sure for Serbia it did some for Macedonia, it did a few lines for Albania. I can't remember now if for other countries as well, but they did start to reflect on these issues and how these issues impact civil society. I think there is a strong, this is a strong incitement for all of us to work towards that becoming another issue that needs to be looked at when you look at the enabling environment as a whole for civil society, right? Because this is a part of the restricting civic space framework, let's call it like that, right? So that's one avenue that, it's underway, but we still need to kind of work towards it being adopted, accepted by the EU, and then implemented. That's one avenue, one possibility. And then my colleagues and I were discussing, and with some other organizations in other Moneyval member state countries, specifically from the Eastern Partnership, from Bulgaria, from Cyprus. I mean, there's a number of EU member states that are also Moneyval member states. So it kind of overlaps through the region and different structures. What would be the way to raise these concerns in a more structured, more formal way towards Moneyval? Because it's such a powerful actor in this sphere, and it's becoming more interested in this region particularly, especially with this regional risk assessment that they are doing, right? And we have already raised these issues with Moneyval, and they have agreed to even participate in some of the national level events and so on. But that's, that's very ad hoc, and that's very dependent on the personal relations. It's very dependent on, who's the president currently and what are their attitudes towards civil society. So that's not a very sustainable way of engagement. And we know how much it took us to formalize some of the engagement with the FATF globally. So now we want to go to Moneyval and say, why don't you do something similar? If the FATF has a formalized way of consulting with private sector and non-profit sector, plus if the FATF is forming a working group to look at the consequences of your restrictions and standards on civil society, this is maybe a time for Moneyval to re-examine how they approach civil society and to open up a formal channel of communication and permanent engagement with civil society from their member countries, right? And this could be done, we think, with, first of all, joint advocacy action, meaning ask basically from all the organizations in the region, in the Eastern Partnership, in other countries. And we know many of them are already interested. So I'm putting this idea on the table. If this regional group is interested to support such advocacy effort, we could easily coordinate it with other colleagues from other regions that are members of the Manival as well. To ask them to open up this formal channel, to give them examples of restrictive practices, to give them examples of good practices, because both are lessons to be learned and discussed. And then for nonprofit organizations to have formal channel of discussing these issues with Manival and member states, because we need to get governments on the table as well, right? So that's what we are actually considering and putting on the table. Having in mind that Manival is a part of the Council of Europe, that there are human rights bodies there that could support this idea, from Conference of INGOs that we as ECNL are also part of. So we can easily get their support. Also the Human Rights Commissioner, Dunja, she could be a strong advocate for such an approach. So there are entry points in the Council of Europe itself that could also support this advocacy action towards Manival and really kind of pressure them to open up to civil society and have some permanent engagement structure. So I would be interested in hearing your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanya. Thank you for the proposals and for opening up the discussion of on a joint advocacy at a regional level. So if someone has reactions about this and other things based on the presentations of today, I think Yuli has something.
Thank you, Vanya. On Partners' behalf, we fully support your proposal. Actually, with regard to the roadmap, we had already the consultation in Albania, and we uploaded the new introduction of anti-money laundering aspect of the evaluation of the as part of the enabling environment. The only issue with that is that we all know that, especially now with the new revision, the roadmap is not going to have any political weight. It looks like the DGNIR, the Commission, is going to use that only for programmatic purposes, which is for us, we said that even in the consultation, is a missed opportunity. So still we can use it as part of our analysis of the enabling environment at the country level. But I'm very skeptical about the political weight is going to carry for our governments. Second, regarding the a more coordinated advocacy effort, that is absolutely necessary. From our experience on the ground, I have to say that we have approached Council of Europe office here in Albania for the last 2 years. And it has been a total silence on their behalf. And honestly, I think it's very unacceptable that such institutions that are also where Manival is part of are so deaf, sorry for the word, very strong one, but it's really, they are really deaf about our concerns and actually requests for consultation and meetings. So I hope that a more coordinated effort on as a civil society from the Balkans, Western Balkans, we will be able to at least impose some space for consultation. It's very ironic that while we are discussing anti-money laundering measures in the country, Council of Europe is coming with a request about assessing the enabling environment at the country level as part of this global report they are doing. And we are a bit stuck. We are a bit stuck even with embassies here. The biggest hot discussion in Albania for the last year has been on this new draft law on registration, which is re-engineering the whole sector and the way how interact with institutions. And none of the diplomatic corps, including EU delegation, has been outspoken about what is their position or how they are viewing our recommendation. And that's because they are stuck into this obligation to, in a way, not impose or not impede the delivery of more strict measures from the government toward the sector. So in a nutshell, we are fully in line and we support the proposal. Vanya, thank you.
Thank you, Yuli. If someone else wants to take the floor. Two participants have raised their hands. Just a moment to check. Sonia, yes, Sonia, please.
Hello. As I had to skip part of the session,
Sonia, we can't hear you. Can you raise the volume, please?
Do you hear me now? Yes? Okay. Thank you very much for organizing this meeting, and it's really good to have a comparative oversight, and I agree with Vanya, we need more of this. I have a follow-up question to Victor, and I have also one proposal for joint future discussion. So in regards to the joint future discussions, I would be keen also to discuss engagement with public and how we influence the narratives that Bojana has mentioned and that are in an orchestrated way used against us. So this is one topic. And for Victor, I had these questions about the arrangement of the relationship within the working group. So who was representing civil society? What kind of expertise did you bring to the working group? And also, how did you deal with the issue of confidentiality and transparency in this engagement? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sonia. Victor, if you may.
Yes, it's the most tricky part of the process to map who will be in your group and who will be not. But actually, every information that was brought to the table was consulted with a wider group of CSOs. In terms of expertise, you will, of course, need legal expertise, not only the specific law on civil society organizations, but also in financial terms. For example, we had an auditor who is a board member of Habitat for Humanity, which is an auditor, and his expertise in auditing of civil society organizations. So that was very beneficial for the process, because of the other side of the table, you have the financial intelligence unit and all the institutions who have this financial, let's say, glance to the issue. So of course you will need that. Also, we have included, let's say, umbrella organizations that are dealing with small grassroots organizations, humanitarian organization dealing with communities, dealing with different stakeholders. So that is important, someone who can represent them instead of having someone which is not knowledgeable in the technical processes and mainly based on advocacy. I hope this answers your question.
Thank you, Victor. I will give the floor now to Gunesh Engin.
Hi. It's a pleasure to meet you all. Actually, I'm from TÜSEV, Turkey. I'm also quite new in TÜSEV, so it was a pleasure to meet you all in this meeting. So I wanted to direct a question to ECNL, probably Vanya. I wanted to ask if it would be also beneficial using the relations with parliamentarians in PACE, Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe, besides expert councils or commissioners, and maybe motivate them to write a motion or written declaration concerning these issues. And finally, they could discuss it in commissions, committees, and then maybe prepare a report, a final report to be discussed in the Council of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this question. That's actually a question we don't know to answer, because frankly, Manival is part of Council of Europe, but they do not operate within the usual remits of all the other Council of Europe bodies, because they're seen as a very technical body and not political body, which we know, from practice, we know that's not true. But in formal setup of the Council of Europe, Manival is a technical body. Now, whether the political pressure from PACE, from PACE, from Parliamentary Assembly would be useful, my initial instinct reaction is yes, but formally, I don't see it as a, I don't see the entry point from the formal setup. But my gut reaction, knowing how these things might, work and operate, would be probably yes, So the honest answer is we simply don't know. We haven't tried it yet, which doesn't mean it shouldn't be tried, right? So it's just a simple of question whether we find a case that is needed to be pushed through such avenue, and then we simply try. We did try with the Human Rights Commissioner, we did try with the Conference of INGOs, reaching out towards Manival. That worked, but these are also particular mandate-related bodies. Whether this political dimension might work, we simply didn't try it, which again doesn't mean it shouldn't be tried. So I'm all for trying it.
Thank you, Vanya. We have Monica Kostanjevic, who has raised their hand. Monica.
Hello, I'm from Slovenia. I'm doing at CNBOS. I am the person who's been doing the communication with, because our office for money laundering was very open to involving us in the entire process of the evaluation process from Moneywall. And the issue that I would say we were very, I guess we're a little different, because we were very fortunate in a way that our money laundering office was very positive for us, in sense that they would not just immediately respond to every pressure that Moneywall created to change legislation. And so our problems were not, as in your cases, with our government body, but we've had a lot of issues with the evaluation process, the communication within it, because mainly if I were, to just sum it up, what happened was they would ask us certain questions about our legislation that we had no idea what purpose they had. So we did not know what kind of conclusions they would draw from these questions. They would just ask us questions and we would respond. And at some points we would see, okay, this is going to a really strange direction. But when the on-site inspection happened, none of these issues really were discussed. That was the only time we had a direct communication with them. And again, we were repeated the same question that we already answered in writing, and none of the ones that we really raised concerns about were really discussed. So we assumed, okay, now they understood. So what happened in the end, we got an evaluation that our government body didn't agree with, that we didn't agree with. And the biggest issue with the process was problematic because we didn't actually have a really good venue for just really talking about what we disagree on. But the biggest issue was, in our opinion, that Moneywall just took authority to make very specific recommendations about what should happen in our legislation that doesn't concern money laundering, but concerns everything. So we had conversations from oh, administrative fees, I saw this in one of the cases, are not high enough to be dissuasive. I'm sorry, where was your regulatory impact analysis? Where did you look at the financial situation of Slovenia or NGOs, how their finances work, to say that this is not a dissuasive fee? Another thing was a finding that was ridiculous was that there is no oversight except for associations, which is one type of, which was just not true. It was like one thing that somebody from the Ministry of Internal Affairs said at one point that was not quite, that was misunderstood. And they just wrote that till the end, to the very, like to the actual fail, like bad grade. So we were also partially compliant up until very recently, where basically, again, very united with our Office for Money Laundering. We, again, even though in the like the reevaluation process, you're not supposed to relitigate the bad grades from before, but we were able to do, to get a better grade. But it was a big issue with like very specific provisions that did not concern money laundering legislation, but other NGO legislation that didn't have the necessary analysis that they would need behind them. And they would just make these recommendations. So what I wanted to say, I'm sorry for being long, is that we haven't really, made any kind of, ideas about how to change the process, even though I was very open, and I did to the group that was evaluating us again this year. I was very clear that I have huge issues with the process. So I just wanted to express that if there's this united thing for communication, not just within like programmatic party, but just like the evaluation process itself, if you want our experience with it, we're happy to provide it.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Monica. We also are happy to receive any other contribution from all the participants that attended the workshop today. This was the first gathering of the NPO sector in the Western Balkan countries and Turkey, but I'm not sure that this will not be the last. I'm sure that very soon we will be again together to discuss on this issue, and as Vanya proposed, on a joint regional advocacy initiative. I think this will be a continuation of this idea. So please, everyone, share with us your suggestions, your proposal for the continuation of this initiative. We will come back to you with all the presentations and any other answer that was not provided to the questions that you might have also after the meeting. So thank you again to all our speakers, to all the participants that stayed with us. I want to close the meeting now, wishing you all the best, and see you soon in other activities. Thank you. Bye.